You think you know pain? Try having someone peel back the wet, gray meat of your brain, looking for a surrender that isn't there. The alien mind readers thought we were fragile. They thought they could break us by forcing us to relive our darkest nightmares. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that humanity didn't just survive its nightmares. We built our foundations on them. This is the story of an interrogator who looked into a human mind and blinked. The room smelled like bleach and old copper. It was the kind of sterile that didn't feel clean, just dead. Colin sat strapped to a chair made of something that looked like glass but felt like ice. His wrists were locked in place, the circulation cut just enough to make his fingers throb in time with his heartbeat. He was sweating. The heavy, greasy kind of sweat that comes from adrenaline crashing and leaving behind nothing but exhaustion. His jaw ached. He ran his tongue over his teeth, tasting blood, thick and metallic, pooling in the gap where his lower bicuspid used to be. He wasn't feeling particularly heroic. The enlistment posters back on Earth promised glory among the stars. They didn't mention the cold. They didn't mention the agonizing, mind-numbing boredom interrupted by flashes of absolute terror. And they certainly didn't mention sitting in a windowless room on a ship halfway across the Orion Spur, waiting for an alien to crack your skull open from the inside. The door slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. No heavy boots, no dramatic entrance. Just a shadow detaching itself from the hallway. The aliens stepped into the harsh fluorescent light. They called themselves the Valari, tall, impossibly thin, with skin the color of bruised plums and eyes like spilled motor oil. It wore a high-collared, immaculate white uniform. There was no physical weapon on its hip. It didn't need one. "Corporal Colin," the Valari said. Its voice didn't come from its mouth. The sound materialized directly behind Colin's eardrums, a soft, vibrating hum that made his molars ache. It spoke perfect English, devoid of accent or emotion. "I am Inquisitor Thule. You are going to tell me the shield modulation frequencies for the terrestrial blockade." "Go to hell," Colin muttered. His voice was raspy, dry. It sounded weak, even to him. He hated that. Thule didn't react. The alien just tilted its head, a slow, predatory movement. "We do not use physical torture, Corporal. It is messy. It is unreliable. Flesh tears, and in its tearing, it lies to make the pain stop. The mind, however, the mind cannot hide from itself." Colin tensed. He had been warned about this. The mind readers, psionics, the eggheads back at command called them. The grunts just called them brain scrapers. You couldn't fight them with fists. You couldn't shoot them. You just had to build a wall in your head and pray it was thick enough. "I don't know the frequencies," Colin lied. He knew them. He had memorized them while staring at the bulkhead of the dropship, a nervous tick to keep his mind off the anti-aircraft flak outside. "We will see," Thule replied. The intrusion didn't start with a bang. It wasn't a sudden, violent tearing. It felt like a drop of ice water landing directly on the base of Colin's brainstem. He flinched, straining against the glass-like restraints. The cold spread. It was a physical sensation, a phantom pressure sliding between the folds of his gray matter. It felt like long, delicate fingers rifling through a dark drawer, brushing against forgotten thoughts. "Fight it," Colin thought. He squeezed his eyes shut. Focus. He pictured a brick wall, red bricks, gray mortar, rough, solid. He imagined the smell of the dust, the scrape of the trowel. He poured every ounce of his concentration into that wall, building it higher, faster. A soft wave of amusement washed over him. It wasn't his amusement. It was Thul's. Quaint, the alien voice echoed in his skull. A spatial metaphor. You construct a physical barrier to block a non-physical entity. Human minds are so wonderfully, tragically literal. The brick wall didn't shatter. It simply dissolved, turning to ash that blew away in a silent wind. Colin gasped. The cold fingers plunged deeper. His breath hitched in his chest as his own memories were suddenly dragged out into the glaring light of his conscious mind. He was 8 years old, falling off his bike, the sharp sting of gravel embedding in his knee. He was 16, the crushing hollow ache in his chest when his dog died. He was 22, standing in the pouring rain at a spaceport, smelling the ozone and unwashed bodies, terrified of what he had signed up for. Thul was browsing, flipping through Colin's life like a magazine in a waiting room, looking for the right pressure point. Colin's heart hammered against his ribs. The panic was a rising tide in his throat. He felt violated, dirty. The alien was touching the softest parts of him, the quiet insecurities, the shameful moments of cowardice, the quiet regrets. You are afraid, Thul noted, the telepathic voice carrying a clinical detachment. Your species is entirely ruled by fear. It dictates your aggression. It dictates your submission. I will find the fear that breaks you, Corporal, and then you will give me the numbers. Colin clenched his jaw, swallowing the blood. His hands curled into fists. He was terrified. Yes. But beneath the terror, something else was waking up. A hot, ugly spark in the pit of his stomach. It was resentment. Get out, Colin whispered, his voice trembling. No, Thul replied smoothly. Let us look at the mud. The sterile interrogation room vanished. The smell hit Colin first. Cordite, burnt plastic, the unmistakable, stomach-churning stench of vaporized blood and wet earth. It was heavy, choking him. He wasn't in the chair anymore. He was in the trench on Viridian Prime. The rain was coming down in sheets, cold and unforgiving, turning the ground into a thick, sucking slurry. The sky above was a bruised purple, torn apart by the brilliant, silent streaks of orbital bombardment. No, Colin thought, desperately trying to pull back. Not this one. Please, not this one. Yes. Thul's presence hummed, wrapped around Colin's consciousness like a heavy, suffocating blanket. This is where your mind fractures. I can feel the fault lines. The terror here is exquisite. Let us experience it. Let it consume you. The memory played out with hyper-realistic clarity. It was sharper now than it had been when he lived it. Colin felt the heavy, soaked fabric of his uniform clinging to his shivering skin. He felt the cold mud seeping into his boots. Beside him, Dean was screaming. Dean, the kid from Iowa who had lied about his age. Half of his face was gone, scorched away by a plasma burst. He was thrashing in the mud, grabbing at Colin's vest, smearing slick, hot blood across the synthetic weave. Help me, Colin! Oh God, it burns. In the memory, Colin had frozen. For 3 agonizing seconds, he had done nothing but stare at the ruined meat of his friend's face, paralyzed by a terror so absolute it felt like a physical weight crushing his lungs. Thul seized on that terror. The alien mind wrapped around the 3 seconds of paralysis and amplified it. The psychic pressure increased, forcing the panic into Colin's nervous system. Colin's physical body in the interrogation room began to convulse against the restraints. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. The fear was a living thing, chewing on his sanity. "Yield," Thule demanded. The command was a heavy, crushing weight. "Give me the frequencies. Escape this place. You cannot endure this fear again. It is breaking your fragile neural pathways." Thule pushed harder, pouring the raw, concentrated emotion of that day back into Colin's mind. The deafening roar of artillery, the smell of burning hair, the absolute, undeniable certainty that he was going to die in a muddy ditch light years from a home that barely remembered him. The alien expected a snap, a clean break, the point where the human mind retreated into a fetal crouch and offered up whatever was asked just to make the nightmare stop. But the snap didn't come. Instead, Colin's ragged breathing began to slow. In the memory, the 3 seconds of paralysis ended. Colin watched himself, felt himself, reach out with shaking, blood-slicked hands. He didn't run. He didn't break. He grabbed the med kit. He shoved a syringe of morphine into Dean's neck, his own tears mixing with the rain, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold the bandage. He was terrified, but he was moving. Thule's psychic grip slipped, just a fraction. "What is this?" The alien's mental voice lost its smooth, clinical edge. There was a flicker of confusion. "The fear is overwhelming. Your biorhythms indicate catastrophic systemic shock. Yet, you act within it. How?" Colin, gasping in the cold air of the interrogation room, let out a wet, rattling laugh. It sounded like a death rattle. You think you're the first thing to scare me?" Colin choked out, his physical voice echoing in the small room. "The fear should paralyze you. It should fracture your ego," Thule insisted, pushing the nightmare back to the forefront. He highlighted the sound of Dean's screams, the smell of the blood. "Feel it. Break." "I did break," Colin thought back, the words heavy and jagged in his own mind. He stopped fighting the memory. He leaned into it. He let the mud, the blood, and the terror wash over him. "I broke that day. I broke the day after that. I break every damn morning I wake up and remember the smell of this mud." Thule hesitated. The alien mind was pristine, a crystalline structure of logic and controlled emotion. It encountered Colin's mind, a messy, scarred, ugly thing held together by duct tape and spite, and didn't know how to process it. "You don't get it, do you, you smooth-skinned freak?" Colin's internal voice grew louder, gaining a dark, gritty momentum. "Fear isn't a weapon to us. It's an engine." Colin visualized the fear. He didn't try to hide from it anymore. He gathered the terror of the trench, the grief of losing Dean, the crushing anxiety of the orbital strikes, and he forged it. He pushed it back against Thule's probing consciousness. It wasn't a brick wall. It was a furnace. Thule recoiled. The telepathic connection shuddered. Madness. You are weaponizing your own psychological degradation. This is unsustainable. I will simply dig deeper. Beneath your individual trauma lies the evolutionary core. I will find the base instinct of prey, and you will shatter. The cold fingers plunged past Colin's personal memories, past his childhood, diving into the dark, murky waters of his subconscious. Thule was looking for the genetic bedrock of humanity, the primal fear of the dark, the instinct to hide from the predator. Colin felt his stomach drop. A profound, echoing vertigo seized him as his mind was violently expanded. He wasn't just Colin anymore. He was falling into the well of something much older. And for the first time, Thule made a sound in the physical world. It was a sharp, hissing intake of breath. The alien had found the bedrock. But it wasn't what he expected. Thule plunged into the human collective unconscious, expecting to find the shivering mammal hiding from the thunder. He expected to find a species defined by its vulnerability, a small, soft thing that had only recently crawled out of the dirt to build ships. Instead, he hit a wall of screaming, burning iron. The psychic landscape changed instantly. Colin's mind was no longer a personal archive. It was a conduit. The sheer force of Thule's probe had bypassed the individual and tapped into the deep, genetic scarring encoded in human DNA. The epigenetic trauma of 100,000 years of suffering, survival, and brutal, unapologetic defiance. What is this place? Thule's voice was no longer a smooth hum. It was erratic, skipping like a scratched record. Colin couldn't answer. He was trapped in the current with the alien, swept away by the floodgates Thule had foolishly kicked open. The sensory input was blinding, deafening. It wasn't one memory. It was millions, layered on top of each other in a deafening crescendo. They were in a dark, damp cave. The smell of rotting meat and wood smoke filled the air. Outside, the ice was miles thick, the cold a physical beast trying to claw its way in. A mother held a starving child, her own body wasting away, yet her eyes were entirely devoid of surrender as she stared into the dying embers. Starvation, Thule processed, reeling from the raw intensity of the emotion. Systemic, prolonged starvation. How did the psyche not collapse? Before the thought could finish, the scene violently shifted. The smell of ice was replaced by the cloying, sweet stench of rotting flesh and bodily fluids. It was a medieval city. Carts rattled over cobblestones, piled high with black-mottled corpses, the Black Death. The air was thick with the miasma of decay and the desperate, fanatic chanting of flagellants. Half the world was dying. The sheer scale of the grief and terror was a physical weight. Millions of minds screaming in the dark. Disease. Unstoppable. Microscopic. The powerlessness, it is absolute. Thule's mental projection began to fracture, his clinical detachment melting under the blistering heat of collective human despair. Why didn't you just lay down and die? Why did you keep breeding, keep building? Because screw the plague, Colin's voice echoed from the depths, distorted and echoing with the voices of 1,000 ancestors. The visions accelerated, spinning out of control. Thule was no longer directing the probe. He was trapped in it, strapped to the front of a runaway train hurtling through human history. Trenches filled with mustard gas. Men coughing up pieces of their own lungs, their eyes melting, yet still chambering another round with trembling, blistered fingers. Cities turning to glass under the flash of atomic fire. Shadows burned into concrete. The absolute pinnacle of self-destruction. Thule felt the shockwave. He felt the skin peeling from his bones. He experienced the guilt, the horror, and the terrifying cold-blooded pragmatism that allowed a species to harness the power of a star, to incinerate their own kind, and then wake up the next morning and go to work. "Stop," Thule pleaded. The telepathic voice was small now, frightened. "This is an aberration. No species evolves like this. You are monsters. You are a cancer of suffering." "We are survivors," Colin thought back. And now Colin was in control. He didn't realize how he was doing it. He just knew that the alien was drowning in the very ocean he had lived in his entire life. The water was toxic, yes, but humanity had grown gills. Colin pushed. He visualized the weight of it all, the plagues, the wars, the famines, the soul-crushing grind of just existing on a death world where gravity, weather, and biology were actively trying to kill you. He gathered all that ugly, jagged history and shoved it directly into Thul's pristine, fragile mind. In the physical room, the fluorescent lights flickered. Colin opened his eyes. Through the sweat and the blur of tears, he looked at his interrogator. Thul was no longer standing tall. The Valari was slumped over, clutching the edge of the metal table with trembling, elongated fingers. The bruised plum color of his skin had faded to a sickly, translucent gray. Dark, viscous fluid was leaking from his tear ducts, trailing down his smooth cheeks like black tears. The alien was panting, his thin chest heaving. He looked at Colin, and for the first time, the spilled oil eyes weren't empty. They were wide with pure, unadulterated horror. "You—" Thul's voice was a ragged whisper in Colin's head, stripped of all its power. "Your minds, they are broken. They are a graveyard of horrors." Colin tested the restraints. They were still locked tight. He slumped back in the chair, exhausted, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The copper taste in his mouth was thicker now. He spat a glob of blood onto the pristine floor. He looked at the trembling alien, feeling a dark, cynical satisfaction settle into his bones. "I told you," Colin rasped, his physical voice barely more than a croak. "You don't want to be in here. It's a bad neighborhood." Thul let out a low, keen sound. The alien staggered backward, his hands flying to his own head. The psychic link severed with a violent snap, like a strained cable finally giving way. Colin gasped, his head snapping back against the chair as his mind was suddenly, blessedly, his own again. The silence in his head was deafening. Thul stumbled toward the door, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He punched the release panel with a shaking fist. The door hissed open, and the alien fled into the corridor, leaving a trail of dark, oily tears on the floor tiles. Colin was left alone in the room. The hum of the light seemed louder now. He was bleeding, he was exhausted, and he was still a prisoner on an alien ship. But as he sat there in the cold, sterile air, smelling his own sweat and blood, Colin couldn't help it. His bruised lips twitched, pulling upward into a slow, grim smile. They wanted to see what humans were made of. Now they knew. The silence in the interrogation room was heavy enough to have a pulse. Colin sat alone. 10 minutes passed, maybe 2 hours. Without the sun, without a watch, time turned into a thick, syrupy liquid that just pooled around his ankles. The adrenaline that had fueled his psychic counterattack evaporated, leaving a profound, hollow ache in his marrow. His right leg was completely numb. His wrists, where the glass-like restraints dug into his flesh, burned with a steady, pulsing heat. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was lined with crushed glass. He closed his eyes and tried to picture a glass of water. Just tap water. The kind that came out of the faucet back in his cramped apartment in Chicago, tasting faintly of chlorine and old pipes. It was the most beautiful thing he could imagine. He didn't feel like a victor. He just felt like a piece of meat left out on a counter. The ship hummed beneath him. It wasn't the deep, rattling, industrial vibration of a human dreadnought, where every bulkhead felt like it was barely holding the vacuum at bay. The Valari ship vibrated at a higher frequency, a relentless, mosquito-like whine that burrowed directly into the inner ear. It was a sound designed by creatures who didn't understand the comfort of friction. Everything here was smooth, seamless, perfect. It made Colin want to break something. The pneumatic hiss of the door shattered the quiet. Colin's muscles seized instinctively, a physical flinch he couldn't suppress. He kept his head down, chin resting against his chest, peering through the sweaty, matted strands of his own hair. 2 Valari entered. They weren't dressed in the immaculate white tunics Thule had worn. These wore matte gray armor that clung to their elongated frames like a second skin. But what caught Colin's attention wasn't the armor. It was their heads. Both guards wore thick, metallic bands around their temples, pulsing with a faint, sickening yellow light. Neural dampeners. They were terrified of him. They didn't speak. They didn't project their voices into his mind. They simply flanked the chair and tapped a control panel. The restraint snapped back into the armrests. Gravity hit Colin like a physical blow. Without the cuffs holding him upright, his numb legs gave out completely. He collapsed forward, his knees slamming into the pristine white deck with a wet thud. Pain flared up his shins, a sharp, immediate grounding in reality. He groaned, a pathetic animal sound that humiliated him. The guards stepped back. They didn't reach out to grab him. They aimed their weapons, sleek, featureless cylinders of brushed chrome, directly at his center of mass. The message was clear. Get up, or we burn you into the floor. We are not touching you. Give me a minute, Colin rasped. He spit a fresh mouthful of bloody saliva onto the spotless deck. It lay there, a dark, ugly crimson stain against the blinding white. An offense. He forced his hands flat against the cold floor. His shoulders trembled violently as he pushed himself up. It took 3 tries. When he finally stood, he swayed, heavily favoring his left leg. The pins and needles in his right foot were agonizing, thousands of tiny daggers stabbing his nerve endings. One of the guards gestured toward the door with the barrel of its weapon. Colin started walking. It was an ugly, shuffling gait. He dragged his right foot slightly, leaving a faint scuff mark on the floor. The corridor outside was more of the same. White walls. No corners, just sweeping curves. No exposed wiring. No scuff marks. No signs of life. It felt like walking through the interior of an eggshell. The air smelled wrong. It was perfectly temperature controlled, perfectly oxygenated, and utterly devoid of dust. It smelled like nothing. They walked in silence. Colin's mind raced, bumping against the exhaustion. Thule's reaction. It hadn't just been a shock. It had been a systemic failure. The Valari were telepathic. They relied on a communal mental network, a pristine web of shared consciousness. What happens to a clean, sterilized network when you suddenly introduce a massive, unfiltered dose of pure, concentrated human trauma? Colin got his answer as they passed a wide, translucent observation window. He turned his head. On the other side of the glass was a massive control room filled with sleek consoles and glowing holographic displays. But the crew wasn't working. It was chaos, absolute unmitigated disaster. Dozens of Valari were scattered across the floor. Some were curled into tight fetal positions, clutching their heads and rocking back and forth. Others were wandering aimlessly, their pale, bruised plum faces streaked with the same dark, oily tears Thule had wept. One Valari was repeatedly slamming its forehead against a glass console, a rhythmic, sickening thump, thump, thump that reverberated through the thick window. They weren't physically injured. They were psychologically infected. The raw dread of the trenches, the suffocating terror of the plagues, the burning flash of atomic fire. Colin had dumped it all into Thule, and Thule had unknowingly broadcasted it to the ship's local network before he could sever the connection. The human experience was a computer virus, and the Valari had no antivirus software. They had never needed it. One of Colin's guards shoved a rifle barrel hard into his spine. The physical strike was sharp, desperate. "Keep moving," a voice echoed in the hallway. It wasn't telepathic. The guard had actually used its vocal cords, speaking through a crude metallic translator box on its chest. The voice was synthesized, flat, but the underlying tremor of genuine panic was impossible to hide. Colin smiled. His cracked lips split, bleeding anew, tasting the copper again. "Careful," Colin whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Don't get too close. It might be contagious." The guard hit him again, harder this time. Colin stumbled, catching himself on the smooth wall. He didn't care about the pain. For the first time since he had been dragged onto this floating hospital ward of a ship, he felt dangerous. They shoved him into a cell. It wasn't a room with bars. It was a transparent cylinder suspended in the center of a larger, circular chamber. The door fused shut behind him, leaving a barely visible seam in the glass. Colin sank to the floor, leaning his aching back against the curved wall. The containment unit was cold. The air inside felt heavy, pressurized. Above him, a soft blue light pulsed rhythmically. It wasn't just illumination. He could feel a faint, numbing static pressing against the surface of his skin, seeping into his scalp. A psychic dampening field. They were locking him in a mental Faraday cage. Outside the cylinder, the two guards took up positions by the main door. They kept their weapons drawn. They kept their distance. Colin stretched his legs out. His right foot was finally waking up, replacing the numbness with a dull, throbbing ache. He rubbed his wrists, feeling the deep indentations left by the restraints. He was hungry, the kind of deep, gnawing hunger that makes your stomach acid burn your throat. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, not entirely, from adrenaline withdrawal, from the sheer, terrifying realization of what he had done and what he was going to have to do next. He was a single Marine, unarmed, exhausted, locked in a high-tech jar in the belly of an enemy cruiser. "Think, Colin, think," he muttered aloud. The sound of his own voice in the confined space was small, pathetic. He closed his eyes. The dampening field above him buzzed, a physical weight pushing his thoughts down. It felt like trying to swim to the surface of a pool while wearing a heavy winter coat. He couldn't reach out. He couldn't project. But what if he didn't need to project? What if he just needed to be a magnet? The Valari were naturally telepathic. The dampening field in the cell kept his thoughts in, but he remembered the way Thule's mind had felt. It had been probing, seeking, constantly connected to the environment. The guards outside were wearing dampeners, but dampeners were just filters. They weren't absolute walls. Colin shifted his posture. He crossed his legs, resting his hands on his knees. He took a slow, deep breath. The air smelled of sterile nothingness. He needed a smell. He He needed an anchor. He thought of the mud on Viridian Prime. He visualized it, the wet, sucking sound it made when you pulled a boot out, the smell of the cordite. The dampening field buzzed louder, resisting the emotional spike. Colin pushed harder. He didn't try to broadcast the thought outward. He internalized it. He built a pressure cooker inside his own skull. He gathered the darkest, ugliest things he carried. The face of the kid who had died in his arms. The sound of his mother weeping when his older brother's coffin came home empty. The absolute suffocating dread of waking up in the dark, wondering if today was the day a plasma bolt turned him into vapor. He condensed it. He packed it down, tighter and tighter, feeling the psychic pressure building behind his eyes. A fierce, throbbing headache blossomed at the base of his skull. His nose began to bleed, a slow, warm trickle of crimson running down his upper lip. He ignored it. He was building a bomb made of human misery. Outside the cylinder, one of the guards shifted uncomfortably. The alien rubbed its temple beneath the metallic band. The filter was catching the overflow, but the sheer density of Colin's internal nightmare was bleeding through the ambient energy of the room. Colin opened his eyes. He stared directly at the guard on the left. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He simply visualized the thin, glass-like wall of the cylinder shattering and released the pressure. He didn't push the thought at the guard. He simply let the concentrated dread explode outward against the confines of the dampening field. The blue light above Colin flared violently, turning a harsh, blinding white. The humming static spiked into an ear-splitting shriek. The machinery running the cell hadn't been designed to suppress the sheer, raw volume of a forced psychological breakdown. It was built to contain refined, disciplined Valari minds, not a human intentionally weaponizing his own PTSD. A shower of sparks erupted from the ceiling array. The blue light died. The dampening field collapsed. The sudden release of the built-up psychic pressure hit the room like a physical shockwave. Outside the glass, both guards dropped to their knees. It wasn't a stumble. It was a total collapse of their central nervous systems. The guard on the left clawed at its helmet, letting out a high-pitched, warbling scream that tore from its physical throat. It sounded like an animal dying in a snare. The psychic backlash had bypassed their dampeners, flooding their pristine minds with a fraction of a second of Colin's concentrated terror. Colin didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, slipping slightly in a smear of his own sweat on the floor. The cell door was still fused, locked by physical mechanics, not the dampening field. But without the psychic suppression, Colin could think clearly. He looked at the control panel on the wall outside his cell. Then he looked at the writhing guard on the right. Colin reached out with his mind. It was clumsy. It wasn't the delicate surgical touch of the Valeri. It felt like swinging a sledgehammer in a dark room. He slammed his consciousness against the fracturing mind of the guard. "Open it," Colin demanded. It wasn't a request. It was an overwhelming, brute force shove of pure will, backed by the lingering threat of more nightmares. The guard convulsed. Through the glass, Colin watched the alien's arm twitch, raising erratically. Its long, trembling fingers smashed against the release console. The pneumatic seal hissed. The glass door slid open. Colin stepped out of the cylinder. The air in the larger room felt cooler, less heavy. He walked over to the guard who had opened the door. The alien was curled on its side, panting rapidly, dark fluid leaking from its nose and eyes. It looked up at Colin, its spilled oil eyes wide with absolute terror. Colin felt a flicker of pity. It lasted exactly 1 second before the memory of the interrogation chair snuffed it out. He reached down and grabbed the chrome cylinder of the guard's dropped weapon. It was heavier than it looked, perfectly smooth, without a trigger guard or a textured grip. It felt wrong in his hands. It felt like an appliance, not a weapon. "How does this work?" Colin asked aloud. The guard merely whimpered, curling tighter into a ball. Colin examined the smooth surface. There was a slight indentation near the back. He pressed his thumb against it. The weapon vibrated, a faint, deadly hum resonating in his palms. He looked at the 2 broken aliens on the floor. He could kill them. It would be easy. But killing defenseless enemies on the floor felt too much like what the monsters in his own nightmares would do. "Stay down," Colin muttered. He turned his back on them and walked toward the heavy blast doors leading into the corridor. He had no idea where he was going. He didn't know the layout of the ship. He didn't know where the escape pods were. He just knew he had to keep moving. He was the friction in their perfect machine, and he was going to grind it to a halt. The corridors were a labyrinth of curved white walls and soft, ambient lighting. If it weren't for the underlying thrum of the ship's engines, Colin would have felt like he was walking through a modern art museum. He moved cautiously, keeping his back close to the wall, the heavy alien rifle awkwardly cradled in his arms. He was sweating again. His bare feet made faint, tacky sounds against the immaculate flooring. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, anticipating the sting of a plasma bolt or the cold plunge of a psychic attack. But the attack didn't come. The ship was eerily quiet. The chaos he had witnessed through the observation window seemed to have localized, or perhaps the Valari had simply quarantined this sector. As he approached a wide intersection, a sound broke the silence. A heavy, rhythmic clanking. Footsteps, but not the soft, gliding steps of the Valari. These were heavy boots striking metal. Colin ducked into a shallow alcove, pressing himself flat against the wall. He raised the strange rifle, his thumb hovering over the indentation. His heart hammered against his ribs, loud enough that he was sure whoever was coming could hear it. A figure rounded the corner. It wasn't an alien. It was a human. The man was tall, heavily built, and moving with a pronounced limp. He was wearing the grease-stained, reinforced coveralls of a fleet mechanic. His face was a mess of purple bruises, and his left arm hung limply at his side, wrapped in a makeshift splint made from torn fabric and what looked like a piece of structural piping. In his right hand, he gripped a heavy, jagged piece of metal, a broken piece of a bulkhead door. Colin lowered his rifle slightly, stepping out of the shadows. "Hold up," Colin whispered harshly. The mechanic whipped around, raising the jagged metal like a club. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, scanning the corridor before locking onto Colin. He froze, taking in Colin's bare feet, the bloody nose, and the alien weapon. The mechanic slowly lowered his makeshift weapon. He let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. "Well, I'll be damned." A grunt. "You real? Or is this another one of their brain tricks?" "I'm real," Colin said. "Corporal Colin, 104th Infantry." "Grimes," the mechanic replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Chief engineer off the Aegis. They pulled me out of the wreckage 3 days ago. Been playing mind games with me ever since. They tried it with me, Colin said. Grimes barked a harsh, mirthless laugh. Yeah, how'd that go for them? I think I broke their Wi-Fi, Colin muttered. Grimes looked at him closely, noting the dried blood and the exhausted slump of Colin's shoulders. A slow, grim smile spread across the mechanic's battered face. I noticed. About an hour ago, the tall freak interrogating me suddenly started bleeding from the eyes and screaming about fire. I took the opportunity to brain him with a chair leg. Where are the others? Colin asked. Dead, or wishing they were, Grimes said, the smile vanishing. They keep us separated. I broke out of a holding block 3 levels down. I've been crawling through ventilation shafts that are entirely too clean. I'm looking for the hangar bay. You know the way? I'm an engineer, son. Give me the hum of an engine, and I'll find the drive core. The hangar is adjacent to the main thruster manifold. We just need to go up. All right, Colin nodded. Lead the way. They moved together, 2 battered, bleeding humans limping through the pristine halls of an alien vessel. They were a study in contrasts. The ship was a testament to cold, sterile perfection. Colin and Grimes were messy, violent, and running on nothing but spite and adrenaline. They encountered their first real resistance near the central elevator hub. 4 Valari guards held the choke point. They were wearing heavier armor now, and their neural dampeners were glowing with a bright, angry orange light. They had reinforced their mental firewalls. They see us, Grimes hissed, pulling back behind a curved pillar. I can't push through those dampeners from here, Colin said, his head throbbing at the mere thought of trying. We have to do this the old-fashioned way. You know how to shoot that thing? Grimes nodded at the smooth cylinder in Colin's hands. I press my thumb here and hope, Colin admitted. Good enough, Grimes grunted. He shifted his grip on the jagged metal bar. I'll draw their fire. You sweep the hallway. Before Colin could argue, Grimes lunged out from behind the pillar, letting out a raw, bellowing roar. He hurled the heavy metal bar down the corridor with brutal force. The Valari reacted instantly. 3 of them turned their sleek weapons toward the roaring mechanic. Silent, brilliant bolts of blue plasma seared through the air. One caught Grimes in the shoulder, spinning him violently. He hit the deck with a heavy grunt, the smell of singed flesh instantly filling the sterile corridor. Colin stepped out. He didn't aim. There were no sights on the alien weapon. He just pointed the tube down the hallway and slammed his thumb onto the indentation. The recoil was non-existent, but the sound was a deafening, bass-heavy thud that rattled Colin's teeth. A wave of shimmering, distorted air erupted from the barrel. It wasn't a laser. It was a kinetic pulse. The invisible wave slammed into the 4 Valari guards like a freight train. The impact threw them backward off their feet. They hit the far wall with a sickening crunch of armor and bone. The pristine white panels cracked under the force. The guards crumpled to the floor in a tangle of long limbs, unmoving. Colin lowered the weapon, his breathing ragged. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped the cylinder. He looked down the hallway. No blood, just broken bodies in a clean hallway. He hurried over to Grimes. The mechanic was sitting up, clutching his right shoulder. The fabric of his coveralls was melted into the burn, the flesh beneath charred black and weeping clear fluid. You okay? Colin asked, extending a hand. Grimes ignored the hand, using his good arm to push himself up. He hissed in pain, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "I've had worse hangovers," he lied through gritted teeth. He looked at the broken Valari at the end of the hall, then back at Colin's weapon. "Nice shooting, Corporal," Grimes wheezed. "It's messy," Colin said, staring at the destruction he'd caused. "Messy gets you home," Grimes replied, leaning heavily against the wall. "Come on, the elevator is right there. Let's get off this flying hospital before the doctors wake up." Colin adjusted his grip on the strange, smooth weapon. His bare feet were cold. His jaw still ached. He was exhausted down to a cellular level. But as he looked at Grimes, burned, battered, and still standing, he felt the fear recede, replaced by a cold, hard determination. The Valari wanted to understand the human mind. They were about to get a crash course in human survival. Colin nodded to Grimes. "Let's go make a mess." The elevator wasn't a box. It was an open platform of frosted glass, enclosed only by a shimmering, translucent energy field. As it ascended through the massive central shaft of the Valari cruiser, Colin felt a terrifying sense of vertigo. Above them, hundreds of levels stacked into a dizzying vanishing point of sterile white light. Below, the same endless drop. Grimes sat slumped in the center of the platform. The mechanic was gray, his skin taking on the waxy sheen of severe blood loss. The air in the lift smelled sharply of ozone from the energy shield, but underneath it lay the thick, sickening scent of roasted pork. Grimes's shoulder was a ruined, blackened crater. "Don't go to sleep on me, Chief," Colin said. He kept his eyes locked on the rising levels, blurring past them. His voice was a flat, tight wire. "Wasn't planning on it," Grimes muttered. His eyes were half closed, glassy. "Just resting my eyes. The structural integrity of this ship is a joke. No bulkheads, no compartmentalization. They build like they've never hit a micrometeorite." "They probably just use a force field," Colin replied, adjusting his grip on the smooth, heavy cylinder of the kinetic rifle. His hands were slick with sweat. He wiped his palms on his filthy trousers, one at a time. "Arrogance," Grimes wheezed. "Relying entirely on active systems. Power fails, you die. Humans, we build a thick wall first, then we add the fancy stuff." Colin nodded, though he wasn't really listening. He was feeling it again, the pressure. It wasn't a focused probe like Thul's interrogation. It was an ambient, suffocating static creeping into the edges of his consciousness. The dampening fields across the ship were failing, or maybe the Valari were turning them off in a desperate bid to coordinate. Instead of precise telepathic communication, Colin was getting a wash of raw, unfiltered emotion from the ship's crew. It was panic. It wasn't the sharp, adrenaline-fueled panic of a human under fire. It was a chaotic, existential terror. The Valari mines were pristine glass structures, and Colin's memory bomb had shattered the foundation. He could feel their confusion. They didn't know how to process fear. They had no mental calluses, no psychological scar tissue to absorb the shock. "They are coming!" a voice echoed in Colin's mind, disjointed and trembling. It wasn't directed at him. It was a panicked broadcast bouncing off the walls of the ship's psychic network. "The disease. It walks." Colin's lip curled. His bare foot tapped a restless rhythm on the glass floor. Suddenly, the smooth, silent ascent ground to a violent halt. The platform jerked, throwing Colin to his knees. The kinetic rifle clattered against the frosted glass. Grimes let out a sharp, gargling cry as the sudden deceleration tore at his burned shoulder. The soft white lights of the shaft flickered and died. A harsh, strobing crimson bathed the area. "They cut the grav feed," Grimes gasped, clutching his chest with his good hand. "Manual override." The energy shield surrounding the platform sputtered and dissolved. They were suspended halfway up the central shaft, exposed to the open air. Across the massive chasm, doors on 3 different levels hissed open. Armored Valari poured out onto the sweeping balconies. Dozens of them. Their neural dampeners glowed a violent, angry red in the dim light. They were terrified, acting on pure, animalistic defense. "Get down!" Colin yelled. He dove flat onto the glass, grabbing the smooth alien rifle. The air above them instantly superheated. Silent, blinding streaks of blue plasma crisscrossed the shaft. One bolt scorched the edge of their platform, melting a fist-sized chunk of the frosted glass into glowing slag. The heat washed over Colin's face, singeing his eyebrows. He didn't bother aiming at individual targets. He couldn't. He just pointed the tube toward the highest concentration of crimson lights on the balcony across from them and pressed the indentation. The kinetic pulse thumped. It felt like someone had kicked Colin in the chest. The invisible shock wave crossed the shaft and slammed into the balcony. It didn't just hit the guards, it hit the architecture. The Valari built with sweeping, seamless materials that were strong but brittle against blunt force trauma. The entire front section of the balcony shattered. A dozen armored Valari, along with a massive chunk of their pristine white architecture, were blown backward into the corridor. The ones near the edge tumbled over, falling silently into the endless dark abyss below. "We're sitting ducks," Colin shouted over the ringing in his ears. Plasma fire continued to rain down from the higher levels, scorching the platform around them. "The control relay!" Grimes yelled, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger at a sleek, glowing console embedded in the wall of the shaft, about 10 feet above their stalled platform. "Shoot the damn relay!" Colin didn't question the engineer. He rolled onto his back, pointed the cylinder upward, and fired. The thud vibrated through his teeth. The shockwave obliterated the smooth wall panel, exposing a mess of sparking, severed crystalline conduits. Instantly, the platform dropped. It wasn't a controlled descent. It was a freefall. Colin's stomach slammed into his throat. Zero gravity hit them instantly. The kinetic rifle floated out of his hands. Grimes's body hovered inches off the deck, the mechanic letting out a breathless groan. They fell for 3 agonizing seconds. The wind roared past them, deafening and cold. Then the backup grav coils kicked in. The deceleration was brutal. Colin was slammed back into the frosted glass, the breath driven from his lungs in a violent rush. His vision blacked out for a split second. He tasted fresh blood as he bit down hard on his tongue. The platform groaned, shivering under the massive stress, and locked into place right beside a heavy set of blast doors, marked with glowing alien geometry. "Hangar level!" Grimes choked out, spitting blood onto the glass. He didn't try to stand. He just started crawling toward the doors. Colin forced himself up. His left knee felt loose, clicking wetly when he put weight on it. He grabbed the kinetic rifle from where it had rolled against the edge. He staggered over to Grimes, grabbing the back of the mechanic's greasy coveralls, and hauled him upright. "Come on," Colin grunted, practically dragging the larger man. We're almost out. He aimed the rifle at the heavy blast doors and fired. The kinetic pulse buckled the thick metal, tearing the doors off their hidden tracks and blowing them inward. They stumbled through the smoke and into the cold. The hangar bay was immense. It was a cavern of polished dark metal, a stark contrast to the blinding white of the ship's interior corridors. It smelled of ozone, heavy lubricants, and the sharp coppery tang of ion exhaust. Dozens of sleek, teardrop-shaped vessels rested in docking cradles. They had no visible seams, no exhaust ports, no cockpit windows. They looked like smooth, obsidian riverstones. Find one that's fueled, Colin rasped, pushing Grimes toward the nearest row of ships. I need a panel, a diagnostic port, something, Grimes muttered, stumbling forward, his eyes scanning the smooth hulls desperately. Colin turned his back to the mechanic, raising the rifle to cover the blown-out elevator doors. The quiet of the hangar was heavy, too heavy. The ambient panic that had been humming in Colin's mind suddenly vanished. It wasn't that the Valeri had calmed down. It was as if someone had thrown a thick, heavy blanket over a screaming child. A massive, suffocating psychic weight flooded the cavernous room. You will not leave. The voice didn't echo in Colin's ears. It bypassed his eardrums entirely, vibrating directly against his skull. It was agonizingly loud. A figure stepped through the smoke of the ruined blast doors. It was Thule. The Inquisitor was unrecognizable. The immaculate white uniform was torn and stained with dark fluid. He wasn't wearing a dampener. Instead, his elongated head was encased in a thick, metallic halo connected by thick black cables to a heavy, glowing battery pack strapped to his chest. He had plugged himself directly into the ship's psychic amplification array. Thule's spilled oil eyes were bloodshot, the dark fluid leaking steadily from his nose and ears. He was burning his own nervous system out just to sustain the connection. You are an infection, Thule's voice screamed in Colin's mind, a jagged, tearing sound. You showed me the mud, the rot inside your species. I will not let it spread. I will excise it. I will crush your mind into dust. The physical air in the hangar seemed to thicken. The pressure in Colin's head spiked instantly. It felt like an invisible vice was clamping down on his temples. His knees buckled, and he dropped to one knee, the heavy kinetic rifle clattering to the floor. Grimes, Colin gasped, clutching his head. I got one open, Grimes yelled from behind him. A soft blue light spilled from a seam that had appeared in the hull of a nearby scout ship. I'm bypassing the launch protocols. Just give me a minute. You do not have a minute, Thule projected. The alien raised a trembling, blood-stained hand toward Colin. The psychic assault was a physical blow. Colin was slammed backward, sliding across the polished hangar floor. His vision blurred, a dark vignette creeping into his peripheral sight. Thule wasn't trying to read his mind anymore. He wasn't trying to extract information. He was using the amplified array to physically crush Colin's neural pathways. Colin felt his memories fracturing. The pain was absolute, a blinding white-hot spike driven through his frontal lobe. He tried to build the wall again, the red bricks, the gray mortar, but Thule shattered it before he could even lay the foundation. The alien was fueled by pure, unadulterated terror, and that terror made him strong. Die in the dark, human, Thule sneered telepathically, stepping closer. Colin lay on his back, gasping. His nose was bleeding freely now, the warm blood pooling in the back of his throat, choking him. He was losing. The psychic weight was too much. He couldn't push back against the ship's main amplifier. Focus, Colin told himself, his internal voice barely a whisper against the roaring storm of Thul's assault. He couldn't fight the pressure, so he stopped trying. Colin relaxed his mind. He let the shields drop entirely. He lay there on the cold metal floor and opened all the doors. He didn't just give Thul his memories this time. He gave Thul the sensation of his physical body in this exact moment. He forced the telepathic connection to flow both ways. He pushed the agonizing, throbbing pain of his right leg into the link. He pushed the suffocating feeling of choking on his own blood. He pushed the exhaustion, the deep, bone-grinding fatigue that made every heartbeat feel like a chore. He pushed the sharp, searing agony of Grimes's burned shoulder, the smell of roasted human flesh. He took all the grotesque, messy, agonizing sensations of just existing in a failing human body, and he dumped it directly into Thul's amplified, hypersensitive mind. Thul stopped walking. The alien let out a horrific physical shriek. The psychic amplification array didn't just broadcast Thul's power, it magnified the feedback. Thul staggered, clutching his head with both hands. The Inquisitor wasn't used to physical pain. His species had eradicated disease, discomfort, and physical suffering centuries ago. Immersed suddenly in the raw, unfiltered agony of Colin's physical state, Thul's mind simply couldn't process the input. The vice clamping down on Colin's brain shattered. Colin rolled over, coughing up a mouthful of blood. He didn't try to stand. He crawled. He grabbed the smooth cylinder of the kinetic rifle. He dragged himself to his knees, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the weapon upright. Through the blur of his own blood and sweat, he looked at Thul. The Inquisitor was on his knees, tearing at the metallic halo strapped to his head, screaming in a high-pitched, warbling frequency. Dark fluid poured down the front of his ruined uniform. Colin didn't feel triumphant. He felt empty. He felt tired. "I told you," Colin rasped, his voice barely audible over Thul's screams. "We survived the mud." Colin pressed his thumb onto the indentation. The kinetic pulse struck Thul point blank. The heavy thud echoed through the massive hangar. The Inquisitor's body was lifted off the ground and thrown 50 feet across the polished floor, slamming violently into the bulkhead. The battery pack on his chest ruptured, sparking wildly before dying out. Thul didn't get up. "Colin!" Grimes shouted. The mechanic was leaning heavily against the open hatch of the scout ship, his face slick with sweat. "We're hot! Move your ass!" Colin dropped the alien rifle. He didn't want to carry it anymore. He limped toward the open hatch, his right leg dragging, leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the immaculate hangar floor. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Grimes grabbed him by the tactical vest with his good hand, hauling him over the threshold. The hatch hissed shut behind them, sealing seamlessly. The interior of the scout ship was small, organic, and suffocatingly perfect. "Strap in," Grimes grunted, collapsing into a sleek pilot seat that seemed to mold to his body. "I bypassed the orbital traffic control. They're going to try and tractor us the second we break the magnetic seal." "Then don't let them," Colin said, slumping into the co-pilot's chair. He didn't bother looking for a seatbelt. He just braced his bleeding hands against the smooth dashboard. "Hold on to your lunch, Corporal," Grimes growled. He slammed his hand against a glowing blue node on the console. The ship didn't hum. It roared. The launch was violently ungraceful. Grimes hadn't triggered a standard departure sequence. He had simply overloaded the scout ship's impulse drives while still clamped in the docking cradle. The restraint snapped with a sound like a localized earthquake. The G-force hit Colin like a concrete slab. The breath was crushed out of his lungs, his vision narrowing to a pinprick. The smooth, obsidian teardrop shot out of the hangar bay, tearing through the cruiser's atmospheric retention field. For 10 terrifying seconds, the only sound was the brutal, shuddering vibration of a ship being pushed far past its structural tolerances. The metal groaned, a low, resonant frequency that rattled the fillings in Colin's teeth. And then, silence. Absolute, profound silence. The crushing weight lifted. The violent shaking smoothed out into a frictionless glide. Colin blinked away the dark spots dancing in his vision. He turned his head slowly. Through the seamless wraparound transparency of the cockpit, he saw it. The void. The endless freezing black ocean of space, dusted with the cold, unblinking light of distant stars. Behind them, the Valari cruiser hung in the dark. It was massive, a perfect, gleaming white spearhead against the night. But it was no longer pristine. From the hangar bay they had just evacuated, a thin plume of escaping atmosphere and debris vented into space. A dirty gray smudge on a perfect canvas. "We're clear of their tractor range," Grimes whispered. The mechanic's head was leaning back against the headrest, his eyes closed. His breathing was shallow, wet. "I set a random micro-jump sequence. We'll drop out near an old mining relay in the Perseus arm. Command will pick up our transponder." "You did good, Chief," Colin said quietly. "I'm going to sleep now, Corporal," Grimes murmured. "If the bleeding stops, wake me when we're home. If it doesn't, don't." Grimes went limp, his chest barely rising and falling. Colin didn't move to check his pulse. He knew Grimes was still alive. Humans were stubborn like that. We cling to the edge of the cliff until our fingernails tear off, and then we try to bite the rock. Colin sat alone in the quiet cabin. The ship's internal temperature was perfectly regulated, but he felt freezing. He looked down at himself. His uniform was torn, stiff with dried mud from a battlefield light years away, and soaked in his own blood and sweat. His feet were bare, bruised, and filthy. He was a mess. A jagged, broken, bleeding mess sitting inside a flawless piece of alien engineering. He looked back at the receding white shape of the Valari cruiser. They had wanted to dissect the human mind. They had expected to find a fragile puzzle they could take apart piece by piece. They thought their telepathy made them gods, able to look down on the unevolved, physical creatures of the galaxy. But they had looked into the abyss of human history, and the abyss had reached out and grabbed them by the throat. Colin realized then that the Valari would never attack Earth. They would never launch the terrestrial blockade they had been planning, not because humanity had bigger guns or faster ships, but because humanity was a contagion. We were a species born from mass extinctions, forged in ice ages, and tempered by our own brutal capacity for self-destruction. We carried our nightmares with us, encoded in our DNA. We were haunted. And now, the Valari were haunted too. Colin had given them the one thing their perfect, sterilized society had never evolved defenses against: trauma. He had broken their inquisitor not with a weapon, but with a memory. Colin reached up slowly with a trembling, blood-stained hand and pressed his palm against the cold glass of the cockpit, obscuring a cluster of stars, the glass smeared with dark, drying blood. He left his mark on their perfect ship. He let his head fall back against the seat, closing his eyes. His body ached with a profound, consuming agony. He was starving. He was thirsty. He had no idea if they would actually make it back to human space before the life support gave out or Grimes succumbed to his wounds. But as the stolen Valeri ship jumped, folding space and hurtling them into the deep, quiet dark, Colin smiled. A genuine, ugly, cracked smile. They had tried to break the human, but humanity was already broken, and a broken edge is the sharpest thing in the universe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the gritty, scarred, and beautifully stubborn nature of humanity, make sure to hit that like button. It helps the channel survive the algorithm, just like Colin and Grimes survived that cruiser. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new HFY story. What did you think of Colin's final defense and the escape? Let me know down in the comments. I love reading your reactions. Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan, and until next time, keep your mind strong and keep humanity proud. See you in the stars.